Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my MSI Day 7 overview and analysis. We've got lower bracket round 2 action, and I'm really excited to get into it. We had our first two teams eliminated in the previous weekend. We got a day off of action yesterday, and we're right back into it, and we're basically going to have games every single day now until the tournament ends, and so a lot of fun games coming up. I'm really excited to cover them on the channel. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Who did you think was going to win today's series? Obviously, you know what I thought. If you want to know what I think in depth and, know what I think about all of the teams in the tournament in depth, you can check out the videos that are linked up in the iCard right now. Up there is going to be my bracket stage prediction video, as well as my MSI primer that I did before the tournament starts, where I go into all of the teams in depth about their playstyles and what I expect from them at the tournament. My predictions so far have been, not to brag, but pretty darn good. I've not only gotten every single series right, but I've almost gotten every single, game score right as well. And so, been doing a pretty good job. I would recommend you check out that video if you want a good idea of where my thoughts are going into this series in particular. But we'll cover it kind of in the intro as well. But I do want to hear what you guys thought and what you guys were thinking heading into it down in the comment section below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about it, because we have a fun series to cover here today. We had a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming and the number 2 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports. Certainly an intriguing matchup on paper. I think stylistically, both of them actually play relatively similar. Ironically, I think G2 is the more controlled team of the two. BLG definitely one of those teams that in the LPL relied a lot on being able to generate early leads. I called them the LPL's Golden Guardians in terms of how they like to play. Ironic considering that they faced off in the play-ins, but a very aggressive team that loves to be able to try and get you early, but has had trouble closing out games, at least domestically. Now, G2, on the other hand, definitely a team that likes to get those early leads. I said this in the previous series for G2, but Europe in general very much struggles to close out games. It's just kind of the region that they're in right now. Leads and, gold leads in general are massive in the LEC at 10 minutes, and so a lot of teams really haven't had to learn how to play from neutral from like 15 minutes onwards in games, and that's definitely been a problem, I think, for both Mad Lions and G2 at this tournament, but that could definitely be something that crops up. But I think BLG in particular are not necessarily the kind of team that can punish it nearly as hard. Now, in saying that, I think BLG are just significantly more talented, I think, basically across the board, and they're certainly in a better form right now. They're coming off of getting trounced by JD Gaming, but honestly, who doesn't get trounced by JD Gaming? G2, not necessarily in a better spot, having lost to Gen G in the first round, but they were able to pretty convincingly beat Mad Lions. I still had BLG going over in this one. My prediction was BLG 3-1. I said that it's very likely that BLG is the better team, but knowing BLG and also knowing G2 Esports, it's also very likely that there's one random game in this series where G2 just kind of win and BLG just kind of underperform, because that's how BLG performs. That's exactly what they do, and I wouldn't be surprised at all to see that today. But honestly, BLG should be the better team of these two. But let's go ahead and see if I was correct in that assumption. Of course, what we do here is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that both teams had. I'm going to give out a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of the series, I'll give out my player of the series as well. And there's no better place to start than in game number 1. So let's go ahead and talk about it. The winner of game number 1 was Bilibili Gaming. They are able to take the first game of this series. They're able to start off with some momentum, and that's really, really good. Both of these teams definitely momentum-based. G2 maybe not as much. They're a team that has shown that they can kind of turn it on whenever they feel like they need to, but they're certainly not the most consistent team. BLG, on the other hand, they really thrive off of knowing that they are the better team in their series. The more aggressive the plays that they're allowed to make, the better they usually are, and the more they're able to get away with, and I think when they're playing with a lot of confidence, that's exactly what they end up doing. Getting this game 1 win, I think, is important for BLG. Not that they were going into the series with anything other than expectations of being able to win. It's just important to be able to prove that, I think, in game number 1. Now, it wasn't this, like, dominant blowout. It certainly was a BLG favored game, and I think they definitely showed that they were the better team, but G2 certainly had moments in the game that made it interesting. So let's go ahead and talk about what ended up happening. Early game was very fast-paced. There was a lot of action, I would say, happening for both teams, specifically around the 3 to 4 minute mark in the game. Both teams really looking for advantages, BLG trying to invest in the bot lane, G2 trying to invest in the top lane. Unfortunately, the first gank for both sides doesn't necessarily work. BLG gets very close to an isolated 2v2 kill in the bot lane, while G2 does try to invest into a gank topside. Neither of those plays end up netting any sort of kills, but G2's bot lane gets really, really chunked out in that instance, and so BLG pretty easily execute a dive about 30 seconds later, and the bot lane that nets them first blood. And that would be a trend throughout a lot of the early game, as BLG continuously trying to get their bot lane ahead. You look at the comp that BLG drafted, you see the Aphelios, you want to get him ahead, right? Like, especially because it's Elk, he's going to be playing super aggro, and if you have the Aphelios in a position where he can, like, get away with a lot of those more aggressive positioning, you know, kind of plays, then it's pretty much going to be impossible for G2 to be able to fight back, because they're just not really a team that's going to be able to handle it all that well. So I definitely like the idea of BLG playing a lot towards the bot lane, but unfortunately for G2, they were also losing in other parts of the map, most notably in the mid lane, where Yagao was just dominating Caps. Caps had no pressure across this entire game. We will continue to talk about him because it did not get better for him as this game went on, but, you know, BLG was definitely, I would say, in control in the early game, even if G2 was able to get some of the earlier dragons, First Drake in particular, which was a good play from them. It was nice, and Yike in general, I think, was definitely one of the better performing members of G2 in this game. Now, mid-game was actually kind of interesting for both of these teams. I would argue G2 played the mid-game fights pretty fantastically. Their positioning was great, specifically Hansama and Yike. I think both of them were really good in the mid-game. Hans was never really in any sort of danger, and that's definitely going to be something to keep track of in a game like this when you have a Cassante, when you have a Wukong, even a Sylas, a lot of things that can dive on top of the Jinx and make your life a lot more difficult. You don't really have a lot of peel. Like, if Gragas isn't staying back, if Maokai isn't staying back, you really don't have a lot of options to be able to sit there and kind of get people off of the Jinx, and so it's important for Hans' positioning to be pretty on point in this game, and I think in the mid-game he was doing a good job with Yike setting up a lot of the rest of the plays. Unfortunately, they did have a little bit of a weak link in the mid-game, and it was Caps in the mid lane on this Yasuo, who just was not very good. He was consistently caught out of position. Sometimes he was able to get away with it, like the play in the top lane. Other times he just wasn't. But, you know, he wasn't really dealing a lot of damage. He was going in fights too early. And really, I think G2 would have been in a much better spot had they had a Yasuo who was actively, you know, playing the game really at all. And unfortunately, they just weren't really able to get that in the mid game. And so even with G2 making some strides to get back into the game, it wasn't really enough to be able to close the gap. Now, third dragon fight is really where things start to fall off the rails for G2. They would continue to fall off the rails, but this is, I guess, where it started. I'm not really sure why they contested this. They were up 2 dragons to 0. They needed a reset timer onto Jinx, who just didn't have her items. You know, she had a lot of gold in inventory and hadn't spent it, so I don't really understand trying to contest it third dragon, but they absolutely did try to contest. Yasuo dies basically immediately, and then the fight completely turns in favor of BLG. They end up getting, I believe, what was 3 or 4 in that fight. Maybe it was even 5. Maybe it was a complete ace. It was a disaster, though, for G2, and BLG's able to get that third dragon. Now, G2 definitely feel like they need to pressure a little bit later in the game with 4th dragon spawning. They see that that BLG really want to try and target it, and so they try to force Baron. Unfortunately, they're just way too late on this play. Jun has already taken dragon, and he's about halfway to Baron pit by the time G2 full commit to starting this. Yes, they are able to smite the Baron. They're able to get it, but the win wall is way too late. The Aphelios ultimate absolutely obliterates everybody in the Baron pit, and it's a delayed ace coming out from BLG, and from that point on in the game, it's just basically unwinnable. Like, there really isn't a lot that G2 can do. They're just behind every single play. They're slow. I think that's the word I would like to use for it, is they seem to have an idea of something that they might want to do, but they don't seem to have the confidence to be able to just, like, pull the trigger on making the play happen. They're just behind on every single play, which is a disaster. BLG do end up running the end game, I would say, like, just absolutely dominating a lot of these late game fights. They do, you know, try to end in the mid lane a little bit early. They aren't able to quite do that, and then they just go bot lane, win one more fight, and they're able to close out the game because Elk is just too strong at this point. And overall, I would say it's a good game from BLG. They weren't exactly perfect. They could have been a little bit more clinical, I would say, in the mid game. That was probably the part of the game that I would say that they were the least effective in, but Elk was phenomenal. He's going to get my player of the game. He was really good in this one. I think Jun was also pretty spectacular. Those are the 2 players that I definitely want to highlight on the side of BLG. Honestly, both sides probably had their jungle and their bot laner be their most impactful players in this game, but Elk was particularly fantastic when he's on, and, you know, no pun intended with the support there, but when he's playing really well and when he's playing really aggro and he's got, you know, the stats and the players to back it up, he's just going to be one of the most difficult AD carries to beat in the entire world because he's not going to give you any sort of leverage. He's going to Gale Force on top of you and then full combo you with red-white guns on Aphelios, and there's really just not a lot you can do if you're down in gold against him. He's going to absolutely obliterate you, so good stuff from Elk. It's, again, another reason why I was super high on him going into the tournament, but June also set him up for a lot of these plays basically perfectly. He ran the map, and he was really, really good on the Wukong, getting on the backline, making sure this Jinx had a hard time. Like I said, Hans's positioning basically had to be perfect throughout the entire game, and unfortunately, it just wasn't. And it wasn't really fair to expect it to be, and so Elk and June definitely the standout players, but I don't think anybody on BLG played particularly bad. I know people hate Yagao for some reason. Like, people just hate this guy, and I don't get it. You know, Reddit is going to Reddit, and it just kind of is what it is, but Yagao was pretty good in this game, and so you know, just credit to BLG. I think as a team, they played really well. As for G2 on the other side, Caps is an easy choice for dead of the game. He's been miserable at this tournament. There really is no other way to put it. I mean, you can make a really strong case that he's been the single worst player in bracket stage of anybody, like on any team, including Mad Lions, including Golden Guardians, you know, teams that didn't win a single series. Like, Caps has just not been good in basically any game that he has played across this tournament, and that is concerning, especially on a champion like Yasuo that we know he plays at a high level. It just doesn't feel like he's in form right now. He's taking a lot of fights that just aren't very good. He's overextending in side lanes and getting caught out for it. His individual laning has drastically decreased. Not only is he consistently down in CS, but he's getting solo killed by players that, you know, people don't really think that highly of. It's kind of insane where Caps is at right now, but he's a hindrance to G2, and there's really no other way to look at it. I do like how Yike played. I think Yike was probably the best player on G2, except there was just not a lot he could do as the Maokai once the team got behind, and Hans tried his best to deal damage, but again, as a backliner, there really just isn't going to be a lot you can do when you have a Wukong and a Sylas and a Cassante that all have gold diving on top of you, and then an Aphelios that's also just going to deal more damage, and so not really a lot that he could do. But for G2, if their mid lane doesn't step up, if their top lane, you know, no offense to Broken Blade, he didn't have a particularly bad game, but he didn't really do anything in this game either. You know, if their, you know, lower links, I would say, don't step up, like, they're just not going to be able to win a game in this series. This was not a particularly enlightening game number one. But for BLG, there's a lot to like here. Elk looks fantastic, June looks fantastic, and those are the two players that you really want to see playing at a high level, and the confidence that they probably built from this game number one is going to be important. So, is G2 going to be able to even up the series at 1 apiece, or is BLG going to take a commanding 2-0 lead in this best of 5? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2 Esports. They are able to take game number 2. They're able to even up this series at 1 apiece, and honestly, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think I'm wrong, but I think this is the first time in the bracket stage that we have had two teams go 1-1 through the first 2 games, which is astounding because we're 7 days in to this event. So for this to be the first time that happens, that's pretty crazy to say, but, you know, congratulations to G2 for being able to pick up game 2, for being able to even up this series. It was a solid performance from them. They certainly didn't make any major mistakes, but this is where I'm gonna maybe get some ire from European fans. I think the standout, you know, storyline I would say to come out of this game was just BLG misplaying and just missing so many opportunities. I mean, it was actually insane. Again, I'm going to give G2 credit. Don't worry, European fans. I promise this was the best game that they played at this tournament, and it wasn't particularly close, in my opinion. But BLG, I think, in general, just, they should have had this game. They really should have had this game. And they weren't able to capitalize on it, which is definitely unfortunate. But what ended up happening? How did G2 walk out of this one with a victory in game number 2? Well, they did not get the lead in the early game. That is certainly not what they ended up doing. BLG, pretty typically for what BLG does, was able to dominate a lot of the early game plays. They were getting a wacky first blood in supportal combat in the bot lane with On. They were, quite frankly, just executing some of their dives a little bit better. G2 do have a nice one in the bot lane, but they continue to try to overplay their hand by going top lane, which doesn't end up working out because Bin is just a little bit better, and BLG are able to get a really good gank mid off. And so it just feels like a lot of the tempo plays that both teams are trying to go for as we get throughout this game, or at least the early game, are going in favor of BLG, and I think a lot of that is why they're able to generate such a large lead. And honestly, I was surprised when I looked up and saw the gold difference. We were genuinely looking at a 4 or 5k gold lead purely just based off of tempo plays in the early game, and that's the kind of danger that a team like BLG poses. They're super imposing in the early game in terms of what they're able to accomplish just in general, and that was definitely shown off here in game number 2. Now, the mid game was a little bit interesting, a little bit back and forth. BLG starts it off hot with a really big extended top lane fight. At first, it basically just looks like a 2v2, it turns into a 3v3, it turns into a 4v4, and eventually it ends up being a 5v5, but it goes majorly in favor of BLG, and this is where it really looks like BLG are just going to run away with the rest of the game, and honestly, in most situations, I would say that they would be able to run away with the rest of the game. For them to be able to basically win a 4v5 without their Aphelios, who has gold at this point, it's pretty astounding, pretty insane, to be honest, and honestly, you know, if you can get that Jax online, there really isn't a lot that this G2 team can actually do. Yagao outplaying some ganks in the top lane. His positioning in this game was really good in the early game. I know a scoreline doesn't necessarily show it, but again, you know, people on Reddit only look at the scorelines, so they're going to tell you Yagao had a bad game. His positioning in this game was pretty phenomenal, especially early on, but you know, some way, somehow, G2 had to get back into this game, and it was this crazy fight in the mid lane where, I have to be honest, this is one of the worst team fights that I've ever seen a team have. BLG just completely implode. Elk in particular is just super far forward. He completely misses ultimate. He hits literally 0 people with the Aphelios ultimate. G2 disengages and then re-engages, and they're able to pick up the team fight win, which is massive to be able to basically re-equalize a lot of the gold in this game, because not only are they able to win that fight, but they're able to use that fight to be able to go get Baron for basically free, and that's actually going to be big, because not only does it give them pressure, but it keeps pressure away from BLG. It stalls the game out a little bit more, and the more time you can give this Jinx to get online, the more she's going to be able to do in a lot of these late game team fights. So really good stuff, I would say, from G2 overall. They continue to keep winning fights in the mid game. BLG continuing to miss position and basically just get outplayed in a lot of these fights. Elk in particular, I think from this point onwards, from like, you know, 20, 21 minutes into the game onwards, I don't think he hit a single ultimate on a single target as Aphelios, which is just disastrous, especially when he was as ahead as he was in this game. For him to have such a bad team fighting stage as a champion who really thrives in that part of the game, it's certainly not what you wanted to see, but G2 continue to win a lot of these fights. They deny Soul. They get the second Baron. They're still really not able to do a whole ton with it because the gold lead, like, it's still a gold lead for BLG, even after all this. That's how big the gold lead was for BLG in the mid game, is that even after 2 Barons and some team fight wins, G2 is still behind like 1k gold in this game, which is astounding, but it really goes to show you the hole that G2 was digging themselves out of. Eventually, finally, G2 get the 3rd Baron. BLG go for this, you know, miraculous catch play towards the end of the game, but they don't have the damage anymore. They've gotten to the point where G2 are able to fight from relatively even, and G2 win the fight. They're able to march it down bot lane, and they are able to end the game. Overall, I'm certainly not pleased with what I saw from G2, but, you know, winning a game is huge, and this is the kind of lucky break that maybe you need to be able to generate enough momentum to push forward in this series a little bit further. My player of the game is going to go to Broken Blade in the top lane. He's been the best performing member of G2 at this tournament. Maybe Yike is in that conversation as well, but the top side of the map has definitely been the best thing that G2 has, and I don't think a lot of people were expecting that going into the tournament. In fact, that was the opposite reason of why I was lower on G2. I felt pretty confident that Caps, Hans, Mickey were going to be fine going into this tournament because they just kind of bounce off the rest of the team well, but I was worried that topside, especially going up against some of the Eastern top laners, was just not going to be as proficient, but honestly, Broken Blade's been really good across this entire tournament. He was really good on the Cassante as well. I think a lot of people are going to want to give player of the game to Hans Sama. He was the one who was dealing a lot of damage in the fights. Totally well-deserved. I thought he had a pretty good game as well, but I just think Broken Blade was setting up those plays miraculously. He's just really good on Cassante. That champion can be incredibly strong when played at a high level. And then Yike was also good. Caps got a solo kill on Yagao towards the end of the game. Mickey was disengaging a lot with Janet Tornadoes, which can be huge against a Jax, against an Ahri, against a Sejuani. A lot of these things that want to dive onto your backline. You have a Janna that's there for disengage and like basically anti-dive. That's going to be massive for your team. Everybody was kind of pulling their weight towards the back half of the game, even with BLG kind of misplaying and really being the ones that kind of threw the game away. G2 still had to capitalize on a lot of those misplays, and I think they did that in this game. As for BLG, though, again, this game was really on them. Like, they were up enough to be able to say that if they lost, it was entirely their fault. I mean, G2 could have played perfectly, and they still would have had to mess up. Like, BLG still would have had to have made some kind of major mistake, but luckily for G2, BLG did make a major mistake, and Elk in particular played the back half of this game about as horrendously as you possibly could have. Continuously caught out, being way too far forward in team fights, not actually dealing damage because you're not hitting ultimate, and you're not, you know, sustaining in any of these fights. It was just about as horrendous of a late game as you can get from an Aphelios that had gold in the early game. If he just plays like a normal human being for like half of this game, they probably win. Like, it really is kind of the difference. Again, I think players like Yagao actually had a much better game than their scoreline would entail, but Bin and June had a lot of trouble getting on the backline towards the back half of the game. Lulu was actually pretty solid, I would say, for most of this, but there's only so much she can do. It really just was BLG mispositioning and misplaying a lot of these team fights in the back half of the game that led to their loss. If they play those at least just a little bit better, they probably walk out of this game with a win. But now it's tied up at 1-1. Like, this is anybody's series. We're basically moving into a best of 3, and so really anything can happen at this point. G2 has some momentum from the win. I think BLG definitely still has to be favored because so long as they play their game, if they get another early game lead like this, I'm not going to expect them to throw it again. But it's going to be interesting. We're going to have to see what happens in game number 3 and who's going to take control of the series. We're going to find out right now because the winner of game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are able to take game number 3, and this time, they're the ones that probably shouldn't be walking away from this game with a win. A crazy back and forth game. This series has actually been a lot of fun, certainly more fun than anything we got up until this point in the bracket stage, if I'm being entirely honest. Not really a lot of close series, but this series has been a lot of fun to watch. Games 2 and 3 were both pretty big throws by the teams that had the leads going into the late game, and honestly, that's a lot of fun. That's a lot of fun to watch, and I think both teams have definitely shown that they have some fight left in them, even towards the back half of games. But let's go ahead and talk about what ended up happening in game number 3, because BLG walking out with a win has to feel pretty miraculous, and Jitsu, I mean, they were this close to being up in this series 2-1. So let's go ahead and talk about what ended up happening. Well, BLG actually do have a pretty solid early game. They're still the ones that are running a lot of the laning phases, and it's honestly just because their players are a bit better in lane, and we kind of knew that going into the series. BLG have some of the best laners in the entire tournament with Bin, Elk, and On, all just being really solid laners, players that are really good at pushing the game forward, and I think that was absolutely the case in this game. Still a lot of nice plays. Yike ends up dying top 1v1, trying to hold the wave after Broken Blade is shoved out by Bin, who just ends up diving Yike. He does trade 1-for-1 in the top lane, which is good, but, you know, Bin playing really aggro on this Jax to try and generate himself a lead that he wasn't able to get in game number 2, and then the Herald fight is pretty disastrous for G2. Caps gets caught a little bit earlier, and then eventually Yike goes down, while the top laners do trade 1-for-1, but this is still Bin being the aggressor, and BB kind of being lucky to get one back, and I think obviously trades between Darius and Jax are going to be in favor of the Jax in the long run. So I would say, generally speaking, BLG have basically full control in this early game, and they're definitely running things like they really have through the first 3 games. I mean, it's really been BLG in the early game, all 3 of these, and that definitely wasn't different here. But I will say what is different is the mid game, where G2 actually start to get a pretty big lead. G2 gets a pretty brilliant fight in the bot jungle that ends up netting them 3 kills. It puts them right back into the game. This is a pretty miraculous fight, especially because BLG was just a little bit out of position. If you can get on top of that Aphelios, you're going to be in a good spot. June was just a little bit too far forward, and he got punished for it. But, you know, good catch by G2. This was a really good play. It's very heads-up macro, I would say, overall from them, and I think that's a good way to describe what this mid-game was in general. For G2, it was a lot of heads-up macro. Bin ends up getting caught in a side lane, but, you know, BLG does trade that with catching BB in the enemy jungle. It's just a lot of back and forth stuff, but G2 are actually still staying in the game. Now, where they are able to generate their big lead in this game is going to be the Baron. They actually get full control over the Baron, which I don't really know how BLG allowed, but G2 do a good job of getting that full control over the Baron. Unfortunately, they decide that they want to flip it. Luckily, when they flip it, they still are able to get it. The fight is relatively inconsequential after Baron, but what G2 does is incredibly smart. They immediately rush to Dragon to go and pressure that. Immediately, they're able to grab that to kind of stop BLG's stacking of dragons, and BLG feel like they have to contest here because G2 is low, but G2 have enough things still left in their arsenal that they did not use in the Baron fight to be able to win this fight, and so that they are able to take the win. They're able to get both Dragon and Baron, and also the team fight win. It's a really big turn of events for G2, a massive swing here that gives them a pretty big lead, a 4 or 5k gold lead at this point in the game, and, you know, when you have Baron and you've got a 4 or 5k gold lead, like, you're looking pretty good in that game, especially because you've stopped the dragon stacking on the side of BLG. A huge fight takes place around the 5th dragon. Both teams are sitting at 2 apiece at this point, and both want to be able to start stacking to get to that soul, because this game feels like it very well could potentially go long, and you certainly don't want to allow your opponent the opportunity to get those free stats. But unfortunately for G2, this is the beginning of the downfall, because BLG somehow win this fight. They honestly just outplay them. Jun with a fantastic engage on the Wukong to really be able to set everything up, and BLG ends up taking the fight. They immediately transition that into going and getting the Baron, which is pretty massive. And then unfortunately we get to our final fight of the game here, which is just a comedy of errors, quite frankly, for G2. Obviously, we can point and, look at individual players making some individual mistakes. Broken Blade hitting stopwatch instead of Stride Breaker at the beginning of the fight. Hansama just point blank walking into the Ahri charm. But at the end of the day, like, all of these things piled up, it means G2 ends up not being able to win that fight. BLG have enough pressure on the map to be able to win it, immediately go and win the game. It's very unfortunate for G2. It almost feels like a homie stock, right? BLG kind of throwing game number 2. So G2 instead goes and throws game number 3. Just back and forth action. It feels like neither team is really playing at all that high of a level in this series, but it's making for good and fun gameplay for fans, and I think that is definitely interesting. Credit to BLG again. Same thing, a similar thing to what I was saying about G2 in the previous game. No matter how bad your opponent plays, you still have to be in the position to be able to capitalize on it, especially when you're down in gold, and I think BLG did a much better job of that here in game number 3. My player of the game is going to go to Jun. I thought he was really good on the Wukong in the back half of the game. Being able to engage a lot and set up the rest of his team to be able to make plays, I think was really big. Nobody on G2 wanted to peel for the Jinx, basically, no matter how hard he got dove, and so Wukong had a lot of pressure in this game from being able to keep that AD carry out of the fight for G2 and allowing his own AD carry to be significantly more useful, so credit to him. On was good outside of getting randomly caught towards the back half of this game. The Lulu was actually super influential in keeping the Aphelios alive, something that, again, G2 just didn't really have on the other side. Bin made a lot of plays in the early game that were good. Yagao landed the crucial charm to kind of win the fight in the back half. Everybody on BLG really held their part, but really I think Jun was definitely the player of the game here for me in game number 3. For G2 on the other side, though, everybody was playing so well up until that final fight where everything just started to fall apart. I think you could give dud of the game to Broken Blade for having a bad laning phase and then also burning that stopwatch, but he was actually pretty influential in the mid game. Obviously, you can't give it to Yike or Mickey. I think both of them were super important towards G2 being able to generate the lead, and even Caps. He made a lot of bad plays in this game, but he also made a lot of good plays in this game on the end. He's just a very feast or famine playstyle, even if he wasn't aggro enough to be able to get that 4-man stun in the final fight. But my dud of the game is going to go to Hansama. Again, not really entirely his fault, but he was just the least important member of G2 in this game. He was not getting any sort of peel. He wasn't really getting any sort of help on his side, and so he had to play super safe, and he wasn't really doing a lot of damage because of that, and you needed that Jinx damage this game. You can blame his teammates for not being able to peel for him, but you can't blame his teammates for him point-blank walking into an enemy Ahri charm and just dying with flash up. Like, that is inexcusable, and honestly, it loses them the game, basically on the spot. And so, dead of the game for me is going to go to Hans, but again, I think you could realistically give it to someone like Broken Blade as well for this Darius game. But overall, G2 had this game in the palm of their hands. They were so close to being able to walk out of this with a 2-1 series lead, but now they're down 1-2, and game number 4 is an elimination game for them at this tournament. They need to be able to win it, and BLG is certainly going to be looking to end this series as quickly as possible. They've run into enough roadblocks. Probably it's a lot closer than they hoped it would be going into this game number 4, so I assume that they are going to play their hearts out. G2 is going to have to step up to the plate and prove they deserve to be here. Are they going to be able to do it, or is BLG going to shut the door on Europe's hopes here at MSI? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Bilibili Gaming. They are able to take game number 4. They're able to close out this series 3-1. And they were definitely the better team in game number 4. Games 2 and 3 were definitely back and forth. Both teams kind of showing that at points they can kind of hold their own against each other. But game number 4 was not particularly close. This was BLG from moment 1. Now, there were some, players on G2 that I think looked relatively okay, especially in this series as a whole. But even in this game, it just wasn't going to be enough. BLG is just a little bit too talented. Their players actually played well for the entirety of this game, and if that was the case, that was going to be a little bit too much for G2 to be able to overcome, as we saw in this game. So let's go ahead and talk about what ended up happening in game number 4. BLG, for the 4th game in a row, basically win every single lane. Now, there were a couple moments where I think some of the laners looked good on the side of G2 Esports, especially Broken Blade earlier on in the series, but Elk and On were dominating bot lane isolated in the 2v2 basically all series long. Caps has not been particularly proficient in lane, even if Yagao isn't really pushing that pressure all that much, and Bin was definitely better over the second half of this series compared to Broken Blade, and so it's just another game where BLG are able to generate a lot of advantages. Now, a little bit weird, G2 want to go for the lane swap here. They want to move Jason to the mid lane and Cassante into the top lane, but BLG actually choose to match, and so they send Yagao up and Bin down into the mid lane as well. Didn't really affect all that much. It ended up getting Yagao even more pressure in the top side, which was more positive, I would say, for BLG in general, because Bin had a lot more opportunity to play, for the rest of the team in the mid lane with that Gwen to be able to accelerate a little bit quicker. But, early game was still very much in favor of BLG, most notably the Herald fight, which very much went in favor of BLG. They just were quicker to the play, and that's something that I've been saying a lot in this series, is G2's decision-making honestly just felt a little bit slow across this whole series. I think with a little bit of a quicker trigger on some of these decisions, I think they actually could have been in a relatively interesting spot, but it just wasn't going to be the case. Really where things start to get bad for G2 is a big fight in the mid lane. BLG end up winning that pretty hard. G2 is just too split up in this fight. Bin ends up absolutely destroying Hans at the beginning, and there's really not a lot else that G2 were going to be able to do without their Aphelios. Look at the rest of this comp. There really isn't any damage outside of the Aphelios unless this Jace is like super fed, which he was not in this game, and so really not a lot you can do, even if Yike is playing really well, and I do want to say Yike is playing really well in this game on the Gragas. There really just isn't a lot that he's going to be able to do here. Elk is incredibly strong, June is incredibly strong, and Bin is incredibly strong, and that's going to be a little bit of a problem for G2 to be able to handle. Third dragon fight is awful for G2. They're just not able to compete at this point. BLG ends up demolishing them. Elk is playing super aggro on this Lucian, and he's able to deal a ridiculous amount of damage. Not only do they win the third dragon fight, they go and get the Baron, and then they go and get the dragon. They're now one dragon away from Soul, and that brings us to the Soul fight, because really not a lot is happening in between here. Like, yes, Caps and Broken Blade are getting caught out every once in a while, but it's nothing major that's actually changing the game. Really what changes the game here is the final Soul fight, which is, again, disastrous for G2. They end up losing the fight, and BLG says, screw it, we don't even need Soul. We can just end the game. Bin is already taking the inhibitor. Let's just go win. And they went and won the game in 29 minutes. 29 minutes was honestly a little bit longer than I thought this game was going to go. It was pretty much entirely controlled by BLG. They were the better team across this entire game, and they really showed that off in basically every single team fight that they had. Player of the game has got to go to Elk. His aggressiveness on a champion like Lucian just shows why I think me and a lot of people who watch LPL consider him to be one of the better AD carries in the entire world. It's because when he is like actually playing well, there just aren't a lot of other AD carries that are going to do as much as Elk is going to do in a team fight, and I think that was shown off in this game. On played out of his mind on the Nami. This is a pick that he has gotten significantly better at over the course of the year. They played a lot of Lucian Nami, and On has consistently gotten better, game after game after game after game, and so it's good to see him really pull that out and be super good on it here at MSI, and obviously their laning phases have just been fantastic throughout the entirety of this series. Even in the games where Hans and Mickey looked good towards the back half, Elk and On were better than them basically every single laning phase. Bin was also a huge problem this game. He's great at Gwen. He has been forever. We all know that. It's one of Bin's picks that I think is most terrifying, and that was definitely still the case in this game. He was getting on the backline basically with ease and really making it difficult for G2 to have any sort of backline pressure, and that continued to be the case. June was getting resets. Yagao was sending everybody up. BLG just looked really good across the entirety of this game, and then G2, unfortunately, this is how you go out of the tournament, with one of your weaker games, I would say, of the tournament. Not your weakest, because the Gen G series definitely still exists, but, you weren't all that competitive in game number 4 here, unfortunately, but I would say if you're looking at the course of this series as a whole, this is the best series that a Western team played at this tournament. This was, for sure the most convincing, I would say, up until this point against any sort of Eastern team, and so, proud of G2 for that. It just wasn't going to be enough. Yike had a really good series, but only so much you can do when the rest of your map isn't playing all that well. Caps continue to be a pretty big detriment to his team, and not so much in this series as he was at the beginning of this tournament, but game 1 on that Yasuo was still pretty bad. And then dud of the game for me is going to go to Hansama. He just wasn't very good on Aphelios as a whole. I hate the way that G2 ended up playing around him throughout the entirety of this series. You need to be able to get him into position to be able to win you the game, and it felt like G2 honestly forgot that bot lane was super strong because they continued to full engage with the rest of their team, and nobody was there to peel Hansam. I felt bad for him. Mickey X didn't really do anything. Broken Blade had a couple of good games, but was certainly not consistent, especially in laning phase, and, you know, there was just a lot of problems for G2. I think, generally speaking, they did hold their own in this series. They certainly didn't get blown back. I think this was a better series than what they had against Gen G. I know both were 3-1s, but, you know, every single loss in the Gen G game was an absolute trouncing, and in this game, at the very least, I think they held their own for 2 games, which is more than I can say for any other Western team at this tournament so far. It just wasn't meant to be. They're going to have to go back to Europe and kind of collect themselves now. They still probably look like the most talented and the best team in Europe, but if that's the case, it's really not super enlightening and super encouraging for what this region and what the West in general is going to be offering at Worlds. But for BLG, you now move on to lower bracket semifinals. Incredibly excited for that. You're going to be playing the winner of the series tomorrow between C9 and Gen G. Obviously, I think there's one team that's a little bit more likely to come out of that series than the other, but you've still got your problems. It certainly isn't the easiest route to get there. I think if Elk and On play well, they can win just about any series. Elk is going to get my player of the series for this one, by the way. He was definitely the most impactful, but if those two are playing well, if Bin gaps anybody in the top lane, like, it's going to be very difficult for this team to lose. However, they're so volatile, they can lose basically any game, especially in the mid to late game, and if they do go up against a team like Gen G, that might be a problem that ends up getting exploited. It certainly got exploited a couple of times here in the Gen G series, so it's going to be interesting, but congrats to BLG for being able to move on. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI Day 7 overview and analysis. BLG versus G2 is out of the way. BLG is moving on. I want to know what you guys' thoughts on that series were down in the comment section below. And of course, let me know what you think of Gen G versus C9 coming in tomorrow. Of course, you know my thoughts. I think Gen G should not really have any sort of trouble with this series. I think stylistically, matchup-wise, this is about the worst matchup that Cloud9 could have at this entire tournament. Should be Gen G 3-0, but if Cloud9 wins a game again, I'm pretty high on Cloud9 in terms of the individual skill of players like Blabber and Berserker. And so, you know, maybe if they're able to just have a really good early game, they could be able to pull out a game. But Gen G is one of those teams that I think is clinical enough to be able to not really allow that to happen. But I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We're posting about every single day of MSI action. Of course, again, if you want to check out any of the other days of the playlist, so that's going to be linked up in the iCard right now. But we're covering every single day of action, and if you enjoyed this video, you're probably going to enjoy a lot of the rest of the content that's put out on this channel. So hit that subscribe button, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live every single day. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.